Newspapers 140 years ago reported on what was described as an awful battle in the clouds and the war of the elements across the American Southeast on February 19th, 1884. Meteorologists today use a scale to talk about the intensity of a tornado called the Enhanced Fujita Scale. They have satellites and doppler radar to track and probe the inside of storms and see tornadoes form. They have networks of storm chasers to follow a storm's path. But in 1884, they didn't have any of that. All they had were the stories told by the survivors. And those stories suggest a tornado outbreak on a truly massive scale that devastated entire communities, but leave a picture of what might have been one of the largest tornado outbreaks in history that is so incomplete that we truly do not know the actual extent of the storm. We know so little that it is still known today as the Enigma tornado outbreak. Tornadoes, defined by the National Weather Service as a narrow, violently rotating column of air that extends from a thunderstorm to the ground, are more common than you might think. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates that around 1,200 tornadoes hit the United States each year, although still today the number of tornadoes is likely underrecorded, and historically, much more so. Tornadoes are often lone events, but sometimes a single storm can produce multiple tornadoes. Called tornado outbreaks, although the term is still not clearly defined, these events are rare but devastating. A 2021 publication of the American Meteorological Association cites research that finds that annually the United States experiences at least a few days with clusters of tornadoes that extensively damage property and infrastructure and threaten people's lives. Most tornado-related fatalities in the United States result from those type of tornado days. These events can be particularly dangerous because they usually comprise multiple long-track tornadoes that persist for tens of minutes and thus can affect populated areas. Outbreaks that occur over multiple days are called outbreak sequences. Certain outbreaks are particularly large, and the largest are called super outbreaks, although that term is relatively new. Super outbreaks are rare, occurring only maybe once every 40 years, and are thus sometimes called generational outbreaks. These are among the most violent and deadly weather events. One occurred in 1974, the subject of another episode of The History Guy, and another in 2011, the aftermath of which I personally visited only a couple of weeks after the storm. The damage of such storms is truly unbelievable, as if the puny works of humans are simply wiped away by the hand of God. It is terrifying, frankly, to think that despite all our developed technology that we are still so vulnerable. The outbreak in 2011 killed 178 people, injured more than 1,600. Thousands of homes and structures were destroyed. Damages were estimated as high as $7 billion. But of course, tornadoes long predate modern weather technology. NOAA notes that, for instance, the indigenous peoples have witnessed the devastating power of tornadoes over thousands of years across the landscape. The power of storms must have seemed even more capricious to them. The system that we use in the United States to try and track and predict storms was still relatively new in 1884. On February 9, 1870, in response to deadly storms that struck the Great Lakes region the year before, U.S. President Ulysses Grant approved a joint resolution of Congress, instructing the National Museum of the United States Army explains, military posts throughout the continental United States to communicate observations of approaching storms to the Division of Telegrams and Reports for the benefit of commerce. The task of establishing an effective weather service was detailed to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. The museum explains that operating primarily as an aid to industrial agriculture, the Signal Corps issued daily weather summaries and predictions, and telegraphed these reports to and from agricultural centers across the country. Furthermore, because only very basic meteorology was taught at universities, the Army instituted its own educational program at Fort Whipple, Virginia. Eventually, the Weather Bureau would be moved to the Department of Agriculture, but in 1884 it was still under the auspices of the Army, which was issuing daily weather reports. While the development of the service within the Corps represented the beginning of a professional weather service, the system of weather prediction was still in its infancy. Weather historian Bill Murray wrote in the Alabama Weather blog last year. The U.S. Army Signal Corps was in charge of collecting weather observations and producing storm warnings in 1884. The weather map from the morning of Tuesday, February 19th of that year showed low pressure over northern Illinois. Temperatures over the lower Mississippi Valley were in the 60s that morning, and From North Alabama to North Carolina, temperatures were in the 40s and 50s. Official weather forecasts for the Gulf states called for local rains, with winds shifting from southerly to westerly and then northerly. For the South Atlantic, slightly warmer fair weather was called for, with winds shifting to westerly and generally lower barometer. There was no indication of what the day would portend. In fact, the weather had taken a notable turn. Journalist James Hayes wrote on the website of Montgomery, Alabama's NBC affiliate WSFA News 12. Strengthening low pressure entered the Ohio Valley, just south of the Great Lakes, and mixed with warm, moist air from the Gulf, pushing north. Journalist Kelly Kazak wrote on the website Alabama.com in 2015. A brooding gray welcomed Alabamans to the year 1884. Cloudy, wet conditions would prevail until mid-February. Then on February 19th, respite arrived. In the span of a few hours, the temperature surged by 10 degrees. Whether residents could have known at the time to fear the sudden meteorological change is unclear. Soon enough, though, the results of the turbulent atmosphere would become all too evident. The New York Sun described the coming of the storm near the town of Jasper in Pickens County, Georgia. At 2 p.m., a man stood in the rear veranda of a hotel in this place, looking quietly towards the summit of Grassy Knob, the highest point in the range of Long Swamp Mountains. Suddenly, clouds began to lower and darkness to gather, until it seemed that the town had been sunk into the night. Darker grew the day until those indoors were forced to light their candles. Then a low rumble was heard, and the man who was watching Grassy Knob turned off to his right and looked in the direction of Cartersville. He could have seen the hills for miles if the day had been clear. Before him, but obscured by dark clouds, lay a strip of country extending for about 15 miles, running from southwest to northeast. Quick as a flash, the low rumble broke into a loud roaring, and a wild and furious tornado hove into sight at the southwestern part of the strip of country described. The face of the country seemed suddenly seized with convulsions, and the elements battled furiously. A huge mass of black clouds with a bright white lining was seen to pass along south of Jasper, first dashing furiously towards the ground and then wildly upward, and then whirling and whizzing and lashing each other, yet moving along with a grandeur towards the summit of Grassy Knob. The oddly named Anniston, Illinois hot blast reported. After the wind swept across Pickens County, along its track were strewn the mangled remains of 20 souls, and more than double that number severely wounded. And all this in less than 5 minutes. The hot blast wrote on February 23rd, Tuesday the 19th is a day long to be remembered by the people of Alabama and Georgia, living along the track of the terrific gale which swept from the Gulf across to Hatteras on that day. Death and destruction followed in the wake of the tornado, and it will be a hard matter to tell the entire damage under several days. There was no language to explain tornadoes, no Fujita scale, no way to describe wind speed in miles per hour. Telegraph lines and railroad tracks were destroyed, and much of the area was rural, with few to document the destruction. Reporting on the terrible storm, likely the most destructive witnessed in the nation at least since European settlement, was both raw and poetic. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette wrote the story of a family near Jasper. Settling down, it whizzed towards the house of Levi Coggle and literally tore it into a million pieces. There was a clash and a clatter, and the air was filled with flying timbers, tin pans, furniture, feathers, corn, wheat, bedding, chickens, and, in fact, everything that the place had to hold. Mr. Coggle was at the residence of his brother, just outside the fury of the storm, and when he saw the tornado coming, he started towards his house. Before he reached it, he was forced to cling to the underbrush to keep from blowing away. As soon as the tornado had gone, he went to where his house stood, and a heart-wrenching spectacle met his gaze. His wife and 2 children were found 100 yards away, dead. Further on, 3 other children, one a baby 18 months old, were picked up in almost dying condition. 2 of them had been blown 300 yards. Scattered about in the woods were his 3 hired men, all dead, one with a huge tree across his body. Thus, in a moment in that house, 6 persons were killed, and 3 others dangerously injured. The distressed husband and father, in the midst of his demolished home and dead and dying family, was wild with grief. Such a visitation rarely falls to the lot of one man. The hot blast talked about damage in the town of Leeds in central Alabama. Up through the Cahaba Valley, the cyclone swept, and at Leeds on the Georgia Pacific, every house was blown down and 6 persons were killed. The house of Mrs. Carr was blown down, killing her, and immediately took fire after and burned. 27 houses were demolished, not including barns and outhouses, etc. Brick houses were literally taken up and carried away, leaving behind but the barren waste to tell the tale. In some instances, cattle and horses had rails and such timbers driven through their bodies. The town was almost swept from the face of the earth. A Georgia Pacific special with physicians and nurses was sent to Leeds and did everything possible to attend to the wants of the wounded and to bury the dead. The outbreak was massive, causing damage and death in Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The number of tornadoes is impossible to determine from the newspaper reports, but some estimates count more than 60, with the assumption that there were likely many more not reported. Some tornadoes tracked more than 35 miles, although it isn't known if those were single tornadoes or the paths of several tornadoes formed close to each other, something called a family of tornadoes. The hot blast reported that the winds passed on both sides of the Augusta, skipping across the Carolinas, and its path resembles that of a battle, just after a bloody carnage. Everywhere the tornado darted to the earth, lives were lost, and homes and plantations torn to pieces. One tornado that struck across Anson to Harnett counties in North Carolina killed at least 23 people, still the deadliest tornado in the history of the state. The Sun reported that the center of the storm struck the outskirts of the town of Rockingham with such sudden fury that the people were unable to escape from the houses. The buildings were blown into fragments. The Raleigh News and Observer reported that perhaps never before in this country has there been seen a spectacle so appalling as that now to be seen, or has there occurred a loss of life or a destruction of property so great as that wrought by the cyclone on Tuesday. The stoutest hearted could not but weep to see the havoc wrought by the storm, to hear the stories of the sufferings inflicted by the terrible cyclone. The Post-Gazette tried to describe the destruction. An old soldier said yesterday, "It looks like there has been a battle here. The village of Yates looks as though it had been sat upon and squelched. In many places, the face of the country has not a vestige of timber left standing. Where 2 days ago were dense forests, now barren hilltops alone are left." A survivor was quoted, "It looks like the elements were on a tear, that the clouds and winds were gone crazy." As ever, the storms were capricious. The Sun wrote about an Irish peddler named James Cannon. He was crossing a creek and the footlog was blown from under him. His pack was claimed by the tornado, but he clung to a stump for life. The Post-Gazette told the story of a Mr. Locke who said, "I was on my way to Jasper from Coggle's distillery. It was earlier than usual. If I had been going home at my usual time, I would have been caught in the midst of it. I would not have been 10 minutes later in passing that road for $1 million in gold." The hot blast noted that a delayed train was saved from destruction by the mere fact of being 15 minutes behind time. The editors of the Wilmington, North Carolina Morning Star opined, "When we know how it swept its wild carnival destruction so nigh us, we have great cause to be thankful to Almighty God that we escaped." Others, though, did not escape the storm's path. The hot blast wrote, after the wind passed over one section of Heard County, Georgia, a whole family by the name of Moore was found to be missing, and nothing has been heard from them save that a party saw the funnel-shaped cloud suddenly settle down over the homestead, wrench it asunder, and scatter the inmates and furniture to the four winds of heaven. The newspaper reports, in fact, seemed overwhelmed by the story. The hot blast wrote, "It is impossible to convey the harrowing spectacles that were everywhere witnessed along the line of the death-dealing hurricane in so short a space. We have merely given a general outline and a few of the most notable instances of destruction. Tales of woe and suffering from this demon of the wind are heartbreaking. It's now estimated that 300 will not cover the number of lives lost, and the damage to property is almost innumerable. A glance over the track is enough to make one shudder with holy horror and breathe a prayer, hoping never more to be compelled to chronicle another such terrible account of the winds, or to listen to the groans and suffering of those who were the main sufferers, and are now beyond all earthly aid." In the end, the hot blast simply tallied the storm to the hand of the fourth rider of the apocalypse, Death himself. The rider of the pale horse seems to have been enveloped in the wind in all his destructive importance, holding in one hand the power of heaven concentrated in his grasp, and in the other reins that guided the dashing monster onto peaceful and happy towns and neighborhoods, and loving, God-fearing men, women, and children. When I was doing the research, it struck me how similar some of these descriptions are to the way that people talk about the devastation of tornadoes that occurred in recent storms that occurred more than a century after this one. In all that time, we have really not come up with any way to defeat the rider of the pale horse. But there was something also really remarkable in the raw and awestruck way that reporters talked about a storm that was so much larger and more devastating than anything they had ever seen or could even imagine occurring. But most of all, there's just the enigma. We don't have any idea how many tornadoes were involved, although even the low-end estimates would have made it the largest number of tornadoes recorded in a 24-hour period up until the super outbreak in 1974. We certainly don't know how many people died. The Signal Corps could only account for 184. They could only come up with names for 100 of those, but some of the estimates went into the many hundreds, even the thousands. Quite a number of those who weren't counted were likely black sharecroppers, whose names were not recorded. The aptly named Anniston Hot Blast wrote that February 19th, 1884 will be remembered with bleeding hearts by thousands. Well, those thousands are now all gone. And so it's up to us to remember. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.